more than anything, they see the Supreme Court issue that was laid out against Harvard and UNC recently, that you can't be racist anymore in admissions processes. What? You can't be racist anymore? Well, how's that going to affect everything? Right now, we're already getting rid of the GRE and LSAT and MCAT and SAT and ACT because they're all racist, because they're objective, westernized standards. Well, there is pushback happening, and there's enough people waking up now from, from the Peter Boghossians to Bill Maher's to Douglas Murray, all the way in between for a Joe Rogan or a Dave Rubin, Chris Rufo, various people across the spectrum pushing back and doing things, and giving people hope that, hey, this is just a pendulum swing. It's a good thing. We can see hope at the end right now, at the end of the tunnel. And I'm thinking, no, this is short-lived, even though it is pushback. And the reason is because what you bring up there, Lenny, is that so long as the ideology centers are controlled by certain radicals, you will forever, eternally see downstream in culture and then finally in politics, the ideas from the universities.
Okay, everyone. My name is Anthony Costello, and this is the Kirkwood Center podcast for theology and ethics. Today, I'm joined by our fellow at the Kirkwood Center, Lenny Esposito.
Good morning.
Lenny, and our good friend and colleague at Ratio Christi, Dr. Corey Miller. Corey, welcome.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me on, gentlemen. This is good to be back with you.
Yeah, and
with this new venue, it's my first time.
It's a new iteration. It's a new rendition of the old. So, Corey, Lenny, and I, we're going to be talking a little bit about campus life right now. What sort of Corey's organization does on university campuses, kind of what we're seeing as sort of maybe a shift in the culture of campus life. And also how Christians can be prepared to engage with students and in the academy. So Corey, before we get into sort of more the meat of our subject today, which is a very apologetic-y kind of issue and maybe even one of method and approach, give us a little bit about yourself, your personal background, especially your academic work, and then talk to us a little bit too about Ratio Christi. Give us some updates there as well.
Sure. So have 4 graduate degrees in philosophy and theology. Had to go after a PhD twice because the first one didn't quite work out the way I wanted it to. I've written 5 books now, the 5th one coming out this month, and working on a 6th one dealing with from campus to culture, an alternative vision for the future, things that we need to do to act now if we don't want to see this whole thing collapse. But I've been part of Ratio Christi for 8 years as president, been involved with faculty ministry for more than a dozen, but in campus ministry or as a professor at IU or Purdue or Multnomah, taught over 100 college courses. So I've put about the last 30 years, I think, into university life, whether teaching as a student or in parachurch campus ministry. So I'm all about the university.
All right. Well, Corey, you mentioned this, and I think maybe this is relevant to our discussion today, that, you did have some pushback at your first PhD. And I want to say that had to do with sort of some worldview issues. This was at the University of Purdue, correct?
Yeah, Purdue University. That's right.
And what were some of the issues surrounding that? What was the pushback on that original iteration of the PhD?
Well, I mean, when I got there originally, I realized, okay, I'm not in Kansas anymore, Toto. You know, it's not like when I was at Talbot in the MA philosophy program. It's
Hmm.
number one, it's a PhD now, but number two, it's a secular university.
Yeah.
And immediately, 6 weeks into it, I'm getting prank calls at 3 o'clock in the morning mocking me for my faith from colleagues in the department. And then, within a semester, I have a professor of Marxism um, putting a permanent note in my file that I'm delusional and schizophrenic. And he wasn't psychologically endowed to make that kind of a criticism. But as a good Marxist, we know what Marx says about religious belief, the opium of the masses, delusional, the God delusion, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what he meant. That paper that he wrote that on, though, was actually one that got published in a journal article, and I gave him a copy of the journal before he retired.
Poetic justice.
Yeah, but by the end, there was this one professor in particular that I had tried to. I took her courses in Plato and on Aristotle. Good professor as far as those go, but very hostile. And I tried to avoid her. I didn't want to do my dissertation on something that was going to require her to be part of the committee. And so I added Latin, brought in Aquinas, brought in Moses Maimonides, still had Aristotle in there. So, it was about a pagan, a Catholic, and a Jew. Kind of sounds like a bad bar joke, but it's not. And I try to do that to build myself as a historian of philosophy so that people couldn't question, my bias and allegiance and things like that. But by the time I got there, I had already had people that like her that was kind of gunning for me. She connected well with my advisor. They had done their dissertations together, and many years back, 2 decades back at University of Pittsburgh, and she's an atheist. Her husband's an atheist who hates William Lane Craig. The advisor was a Jewish Maimonidean scholar. And she talked with him. She told me she was going to talk with him. And within the week, he called me or emailed me and gave me a couple of sentences that said, long ago, I told you not to impose this Protestantization of faith on Moses Maimonides, but there it is. So my last piece of advice for you for your career is to find another advisor. Well, what he meant by that is I was doing my dissertation in part on the virtue of faith, looking at the philosophical work that faith does in Aquinas' whole system and in Maimonides' whole system, and how the virtue of faith is functionally analogous to Aristotle's master virtue, phronesis, prudence, practical wisdom. It does the same work in all three of these philosophers' system. And so he didn't like that. It became an exegetical issue. 15 minutes, I proved to him, why couldn't he just let me pass through and get the dissertation going? I was all but dissertation at that time. And it came down to Maimonides doesn't believe faith is a virtue. He does. I've been researching it. He doesn't. He does. And I quoted his magnum opus, and he says, I refer to the virtue of faith, and he cites Genesis 15:6. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Oh, okay, well, I'll come back on your committee, but I won't be your advisor. But that's all it took.
This was the Jewish advisor. This man was himself Jewish.
He was Jewish.
Like a believing devout?
Probably pantheist or atheist, but that's
okay.
The majority of Jews today are probably non-theistic.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the guys who was a prominent co-author of his and whose view I was defending in Haifa, Israel, wrote a book, Must a Jew Believe Anything? And that's a serious question because you'd think monotheism, but no, that's not enough. It's more, they're more aligned by the tradition, solidarity, and persecuted people, and so forth.
Yeah. It's cultural. Yeah,
that's right. And so I needed another author, and so I thought I'm going to get his co-author, who is a more robust Maimonidean scholar. And I called him in Haifa, Israel, and he said, well, who was your previous advisor? And I told him, and he says, oh, no, I'm not touching it. The community's too small. It's a hot potato. So I couldn't find an advisor for the life of me. And without an advisor, even if you have a full committee, which I did, even this guy came back on board, you can't register for research hours. And without registering after a semester, you're gone. So I had to terminate with a 5-year master's degree there. And I had William Rowe that I learned about at Talbot, as I learned about Nietzsche, and I learned about Aquinas when I was at Talbot. I was one of Rowe's last students before he retired and then died. And he ended up writing for me a letter of recommend that got me into the University of Aberdeen, where I finally completed the PhD. And 2 months later, I was invited by Ratio Christi to be their president, to interview to be their president.
So when was all that shaking down, in like the early 2000s or 90s? I don't want to date you. You look like a very young man to me, so it seems like
2004 to 2009 was I was a PhD student at Purdue, teaching at IU at the time. Took a year off to raise support, go on staff at the Faculty Commons to go after professors after what had happened to me.
Yeah,
and launched continue the professor ministry there at Purdue. Continued to teach at Indiana University, where I taught for over a dozen years. And by 2013 or 14, I remember 14, I finally got the PhD, I think, in December, after defending against the guy who claims in The Guardian, when he was going after J.K. Rowling, to be the only trans philosopher in the UK. He's an Augustine scholar too, by the way.
Wow.
And a leader in the Church of Scotland.
At least he's going after the guy who historically would disagree with him most.
He did not. When I defended
your opponents.
Yeah. When I defended the dissertation or the viva over there, he did not like my handling of Aristotle, and he said, "What's the Nicomachean ethics about?" And I said, "Happiness." He goes, "That's right. Then why do you mention God so often and make such a big deal about it?" And I said, "Because Aristotle uses theos or its cognates twice as much as he uses eudaimonia and its cognates. Aristotle cannot get a system off the ground without God."
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that might not shake out well for that philosopher. But we understand. Okay. All right. So you had your own personal journey there in the conflict of worldviews within the academic world. You have been with Ratio Christi now. For how long have you been with Ratio Christi?
8 years.
8 years with Ratio Christi. And explain to us again the work of Ratio Christi as a ministry. What's its primary focus?
Yeah, my first introduction to them was I was headed over to defend my dissertation, and I spoke at one of their chapters at the University of Edinburgh in the David Hume Towers on the moral argument for God's existence, and then defended my dissertation. And that was my first on-site encounter with them. I'd heard about them before, first on-site, which, by the way, this is a freebie, but that building's been renamed since the George Floyd debacle, and it's now called 40 George Square. So even
I was curious if there was
40 George.
Yeah, 40 is the road number.
They combined two names.
Yeah, they got rid of, that's right. And they got rid of David Hume in favor of George.
I wonder what Douglas Murray has to say about that.
I don't know, but I think the only more provocative thing you could have done was given a talk on miracles at that.
Right.
Because I mean, obviously that's speaking on the moral argument at the David Hume. That's just amazing.
Yeah, and so George Floyd impacted the UK in getting rid of Hume because Hume gave a little footnote somewhere that he was a racist, and statues are toppling. Marx's are going up, and Alfred Kinsey's are going up, but other statues are being toppled. But
we want to get back to that. That's kind of indicative of what we're going to get to, right? But so finish off your story of how you got engaged with Ratio Christi what Ratio.
Yeah, so Ratio Christi, I saw them. They were new, very in their infancy, I would say. It's still in their diapers. Today we're now in puberty, in adolescence, and the mission was equipping students, and I changed it on week 1. I added professors. So equipping students and professors with historical, philosophical, and scientific reasons for following Jesus. We modified our mission statement when I came on board because we started finding that many, we weren't just being pushed away by university administrators, but even by church pastors. And so we modified it to be able to speak more rhetorically attractive to the pastors. Thoughtful Christianity, where a thoughtful person is a compassionate person, but also someone that's reflective. So it's both heart and mind. Thoughtful Christianity, transforming lives on campus today, changing culture tomorrow. So I saw this movement as an opportunity, different from Crew that I was involved with, that loved the life of the mind. Crew didn't necessarily love the life of the mind, and I think that's one reason why they've given way to certain levels of mission drift that we can talk about later.
Yeah.
And they loved the life of the mind. I had already been in litigation as an undergrad and won. I had already been in litigation as a professor at Indiana University, and they had to back away from there. I got exonerated. And I'd gone through what I did at Purdue, and I saw Ratio Christi was kind of like me. God had built me into a fighter. If there's something that I can agree with Marx on, is that he says that philosophers have historically interpreted reality, but the goal is, after all, to change it. And I believe in being a Christian activist because we have a good message and we have a good worldview, and we want to at least have a place at the table. If we can get more, great, but at least that. And I saw that Ratio Christi was an organization that was not only about apologetics, and then we quickly put /evangelism on there, so that it is an apologetics evangelism, and we bring on people that are evangelistic apologists. Organization like that can see souls saved by God's grace, but that we see the strategy of the role of apologetics in a culture now that has morphed. It's no longer got Christian background assumptions. That's been gone for at least a generation. We're in Mars Hill. We're not in Acts 2 or Acts 4 or anything like that. And so they read the culture right on that. The first organization on campus that's apologetics evangelism focused. And then, boom, right away, we started getting into litigation, and now we've won 4 federal victories, Supreme Court victory, and we are currently still in litigation with the Secular Student Alliance, American Atheists, and the Biden administration's Department of Education. We happen to be in the convoluted position of defending Joe, and they're suing Joe because they sued on Trump's last day. We jumped in as an intervening defendant within 1 week. So we were thinking about buying T-shirts to say we stand for Joe. But that's where we're at. We have a prof ministry. We have a college prep ministry for undergrads, and then we've got our standard college student ministry. And most recently, we just launched last year, so we're in year 2 now, of bringing on PhD students, stipending them when they get accepted at top level Research One PhD programs, and training them on how not to be a professor who happens to be a Christian, but a Christian professor, a missional professor. And part of their requirement is then to turn around and do the exact same thing. And so they launch PhD chapters that are not titled Ratio Christi for covert reasons. But they're already doing that at major universities like Rutgers and Baylor, and now we'll launch at 4 more this next semester.
Well, that's a great update. I think, Francis Schaeffer explicated this best in the previous generation, how worldviews shift, at least in the Western civilization, through the academy. It's really through the academy that a culture is shaped. And I've relayed this before on other podcasts. There was you go back to the 4th century. Constantine obviously allows for Christianity to be practiced in the empire. Yeah. His son Constantinus was a Christian of some sort. But then right after Constantinus, you get an emperor who, fortunately, by the grace of God, only rules for 3 years. His name's Julian. And he's well known in history as Julian the Apostate, because his main goal is to return the empire back to formal pagan worship and to eliminate Christianity from the empire. And the very first thing he does is shut down all of the Christian schools in the empire. and reinstates pagan teaching in the schools. So he knew as well that the way to shape the generation is through academic training. Beliefs, basically it's the generation that believes that's going to shape the next one. And then, Schaeffer shows in his works how it filters down then out into the popular culture, 30 to 40 years later, whatever. So if we cannot impact, and we discussed this the last time we talked, which is a few years ago now, the ratios of, liberal or leftist professors or non-believers to even conservative professors, and how staggeringly disproportionate those ratios have been for a long time. And if you can't impact the academy in some way, in some significant way, well, then it's no wonder that Barbie is one of your top selling movies right now.
Right. Yeah. And from what you said there, James Davison Hunter is an American sociologist who wrote the book To Change the World: The Irony, Tragedy, and Possibility of Christianity in the Late Modern World. He makes the point too, because a lot of people say, well, no, the university is not that influential. He says, look, an idea might emerge from the masses, he says. It does not gain traction until it is embraced and propagated by the elites. And so the university philosophizes, and then the media popularizes, and then the government politicizes. That's how it goes.
Right. And that's the same Hunter that wrote with Nedeleski, right? The book with Nedeleski, I think, Science and the Good. I mean, maybe. Yeah. But that's a good point, because that's something that Reagan understood. I mean, Reagan in his Evil Empire speech, he cites Lewis, where is it in Lewis, where Lewis talks about how the wars are not started by the generals on the battlefield, but by the clean shaven, quiet professorial types sitting in their offices, in their dimly lit offices, right, where the ideas are first hatched. So
I think you can look even at the student body and see this trend. While there's always been a disproportionate number of liberals within the higher academic circles, it hasn't been as disproportionate as we see it now. Obviously, that's increased. But the student body in, say, the 80s and the 90s, there was a fairly balanced number of conservative young people coming into school than there were liberal young people, and that has completely shifted. So what happens in these instances is not only, of course, the most wealthy and the most successful companies will hire people from the most prestigious institutions, and those institutions, of course, set a standard goal. If you hire a vice president of marketing, you're assuming that that person, because of their credentials, has a capability and a knowledge that supersedes your own, even as a CEO in certain instances. Right. And so you trust them. And in the case of Anheuser-Busch, of course, that was a train wreck waiting to happen. But there are 300 others, all the Fortune 500 companies have this issue. But you also train a cadre of educators who not merely replicate themselves at the college level, but they're high school teachers, right? Educational standards. The people who are leading the departments of education in the different states are coming from these Ivy League type institutions, these elite universities, and the standards that they're setting for their high school teachers, for their elementary school teachers, are going to shift the concepts so that you don't even have to hit college yet before you're inculcated with all of this. And I think if you look at the trends, like I said, from the 90s to today, I think you see that very, very clearly.
Yeah, and there are people who think, hey, this Bud Light issue, it's an indicator of pushback. Or in the Wall Street Journal recently, it mentioned how corporate America is starting to shed its DIE, die officers. I don't call it DEI.
Yeah, die. Exactly.
They shed their die officers because after a while, they played the guilt game for a couple of years after 2020, but they've realized, man, this gets expensive, and it's like walking on eggshells around the office. But more than anything, they see the Supreme Court issue that was laid out against Harvard and UNC recently that you can't be racists anymore in admissions processes. What? You can't be racist anymore? Well, how's that going to affect everything? Right now, we're already getting rid of the GRE and LSAT and MCAT and SAT and ACT because they're all racist, because they're objective, westernized standards. Well, there is pushback happening, and there's enough people waking up now from, you know, from the Peter Boghossians to Bill Maher's to Douglas Murray, all the way in between for a Joe Rogan or a Dave Rubin, Chris Rufo, various people across the spectrum pushing back and doing things and giving people hope that, hey, this is just a pendulum swing. It's a good thing. We can see hope at the end right now, at the end of the tunnel. And I'm thinking, no, this is short-lived, even though it is pushback. And the reason is because what you bring up there, Lenny, is that so long as the ideology centers are controlled by certain radicals, you will forever, eternally see downstream in culture and then finally in politics the ideas from the universities. And in the book that I'm working on now, I talk about, you know, this is not grandma's America anymore. What just happened? Giving illustrations from the corporate world to the seminaries, to the churches, to, you know, at K through 12 institutes and so forth. And then showing it's the university, stupid. Don't follow the money trail, follow the ideas trail, and it goes upstream to the universities. And these ideas in two different revolutions, one overturned what we Christians had founded, and number two, and it forced us to launch new seminaries, new Christian institutes. And now in phase two, or revolution two, some of revolutionaries number one, the Robespierres, the Richard Dawkins types, are now getting beheaded by their own guillotine system that they had set up. And this new revolution has infiltrated the churches, seminaries, Christian academic societies, campus ministries, all the flora and fauna, and with DEI or DIE officers going into the seminaries as political commissars, things are bound to change in those institutions. And so higher ed across the board right now, from secular, scientistic to postmodern cultural Marxist universities, all the way to evangelical ones, are now falling under the spell and having to choose which side they're on, because ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims.
Well spoken, sir. And you know, we had an interview recently that'll go up soon on classical education, you know, which is also an emerging movement, and one definitely worth supporting. You know, and there's been, you know, for the longest time now, especially in apologetics circles, you know, you get the story of, oh, you know, we raised our child evangelical Christian, you know, with good morals and you know, we and in the faith, and then, you know, sent off to the university, and they have their first biology class or their first sociology class, and then, you know, by the end of freshman year, their faith has collapsed. And there might be just that might just be sometimes part of the sort of life cycle of the believer, that we often have to have certain kind of challenges and experiences that then help us to reinforce our beliefs. But, you know, one of the things that then I think has often been said is, well, what we need then is we need to supply parents with apologetics resources so that we can raise the kids with apologetics. And then we have to have alternative means or modes of education. You got to get it, you know, homeschooling, and we got to get promote classical education. And that's all good. I'm all for that. But what oftentimes gets missed there is, oh, well, we got to go and retake the institutions. You know, we got to go back and actually fight against the entities that and the ideas that have overtaken all these institutions that the church started to begin with, the Christians started to begin with. We can't just don't give up there. Let's go fight the fight there at the source of, you know, the source of evil, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah,
And you can do
Roger's
both,
book.
right?
You can, that's right. And we ought to do both.
Yeah.
A two-front battle.
Right.
Roger's more recent book, Live Not by Lies. It follows his Benedict option, which I was like, that stuff is just stuff we should have been doing all along. But the Live Not by Lies, it's a good book. The subtitle is A Manual for Christian Dissidents. I call it a manual for defeatist Christian dissidents, because he says we have lost the culture war. It's over. And I'm thinking, no, that's the problem. In the 80s, we were building bunkers underground because of possible nuclear bombs and fallout, and only those who had the bunkers would survive. And Drewer's book is pretty dreary in this sense. Build the bunkers, go down, establish your homeschool Christian, civilization. And when everybody's dead on the surface, then we come back up and start civilization again.
He's moved to Hungary now. He's not even living in the United States anymore.
And that's where Peter Boghossian's now speaking quite a bit as well.
In Hungary?
Yeah, and he told me, he says, I'm surprised you're not there. Isn't that where all conservatives go to speak? I'm like, yeah, why are you there? But yeah, you're right. But I think this, it comes back to again, the two-front war, because the barbarians are no longer just at the gates, they're in the citadels. And so, as we draw out the evolution of the American university, I think the last time we talked, I hadn't visited all. Now I've visited every one of the colonial schools. I've been to all of them. I've examined their architecture and see the Bible verses on there, look at their mottos. And, for the first relatively 250 years since 1636, they were virtually all Protestant. All presidents were members of the clergy, all taught the capstone class of moral philosophy. Church and chapel attendance were required until 1880 to 1930 began the fallout and the loss. And we lost. Two things were happening, because it's happening again today. One was the ideology that had crept in methodological naturalism, scientism, and so forth. But the other was really practical considerations. People wanted to get other education pursuits for economic reasons. And so they had to start adding things to the divinity program and put the divinity program in the back of the acreage, and put engineering out here and math and all other kinds of good things. And then also, as America was growing, populations were morphing, and you couldn't be, a parochial denominational school anymore. You had to be secular, appealing to everybody. That's all fine and dandy, but the ideology centers got taken over from the top. And that's what's happening again. It started, as you all know, through Gramsci's Long March Through the Institutions. And at that same time in the 1930s, that was going on in the Axis powers of Marxism in Germany and Italy, that morphed, came over here. And by the 60s, they tried to make their move. The New Left didn't really happen. We had the Civil Rights Movement, other things. Martin Luther King was concerned more about the content of character and not skin color. Well, the critical theorists then became critical race theory, launched in a church with stained glass windows, they boast, in 1989 up in Wisconsin. And right around that time, to Lenny's comment, and as people like Steven Pinker note, there was a 2.3 to 1 ratio of liberal to conservative. And over the last 3 decades, that has gone from 12 to 1 to 23 to 1 to 27 to 1. And now the poor liberals are being ousted themselves. But with this new virus has morphed, and it's gone into the Christian church, who, since we excommunicated the head of Christ and retained only the heart and hands of Christ, we weren't prepared for this to come in. And now it's come into our seminaries, and we can go on and we can talk about how this is happening right now at certain key seminaries and their boards and professors and so forth. But it's all around. And so you're right. We need to continue to do what Drew was saying. We need to build the infrastructure with our families as, cell groups that are resistant somehow, have some kind of immunity. But we also need to go after the institutions, because we can't run anywhere. These people are now, they've told us to go into the closets, but they're now coming into our closets as well. So we need to have a revolution of our own, and we need to do the long march through the institutions, reclaiming as we go, but also tactfully and covertly getting back into the institutions that we founded. It can happen. It's happened already. It's happening a second time. Why can't it happen a third time? Why shouldn't it be us?
Let me ask you another question, though, because I think the picture that Tony paints of the homeschool child let loose in the university system, and I don't necessarily think that it's either the biology teacher who sways them. I think that may have been true 10, 20 years ago. They would get rocked by certain scientific theories when people were loath to talk about them. But what I see is going on, especially with undergrads today, is they're more passionate and they're more concerned about social issues, because that's the conversation that's happening in our society. Why is there inequality in these different groups? So they see people as groups, first of all. There's a presupposition there that either racial groups or economic groups or religious, that's somehow an appropriate way to understand people is through their group dynamic. So that's one issue. But when they see that, then they start asking questions, because they hold on to the ethos of we should help all people, we should lift up the underdog. And I think if the church hasn't addressed that part of it, when they hit the sociology or the English literature department, that's when it starts to resonate. So the university's having discussions that the church has never even entered into in those regards. And again, you have to do this through a thoughtful discourse, through reasoning and analyzing. Does this make the most sense? Is this really the way it's going on? But we were talking earlier, nobody in apologetics today, the cutting edge apologetics, it's not about defeating Dawkins anymore.
Right.
So cultural apologetics is a much more important aspect. And so can you address those issues?
Yeah. Part of it is going back to Alan Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind, Mark Knowles, The Scandal of the American Mind. Carl Trueman has written What is the Real Scandal recently. But in any case, it's the whole of American society that we've cut off the head and have an anti-intellectualism here now. We're like Rome, which was the Greco-Roman world, helped shape and birth Western civilization, and then ended up with the Colosseum. And that's where we're at now. And the university plays the role of the Greco-Roman world in shaping civilization today. It is Greece and Rome today. And so, recently we did some surveys to get a sense from our staff that are on the field. I mean, Ratio Christi was the first Christian organization in the country that I'm aware of to put anything of substance out on the issue of critical theory, because we could smell it early on. I mean, I had been published, I'd been trained in Marxism, our people are on the secular university campuses. We can see what's coming. I saw this coming in 2004 when I was there, going, oh my gosh, this is how it happens. And one of my classmates now has been, investigated by the Texas Attorney General. I saw this stuff happening way back then, and didn't really know what liberation theology was in seminary. I saw, that sounds bad, but it's not going to affect us very much. It's down in South America. But in our recent surveys, our staff showed that, in terms of the cultural issues, philosophical was about 20 on the surveys, interpersonal was about 12, religious about 15, other about 6. Almost 60% were identity politics and ethics issues. So number one, that is the dominant reigning ideology that is and has been in the university ivory towers for some time, and has now effectively filtered out into the flora and fauna of society, which is where Gramsci's note then is now, once you get ensconced to that level, then the war of movement can come and things can begin to topple. And you're seeing it with our brass and the military and law enforcement and things like that now. But the other thing to mitigate this, I think, is this. So I'm not giving up on the go after the Dawkins or the naturalism completely, because Marxism is still
Naturalism.
Dawkins. It's just
it's a pillar. It's a pillar.
But when you think about philosophy as, what is real? How do I know what is real? How should I then live based on what I know about reality? Most of the world fights on the tip of the iceberg on ethics, and really up at the tip on applied ethics, identity politics, and ethical issues. Politics was always part of ethics until the Enlightenment, when everything had to become a science. And that's when it got its name, political science. But it was never, for 2,500 years, it was always part of ethics. But it's not the tip of the iceberg that sank the Titanic. It's the knowledge systems and views of reality below that sank the Titanic. That stuff is still happening. It's just the masses, what you're seeing on the news and the media, and the students at the universities, and even the middle schoolers coming home. I mean, heaven's sake, there are more self-identifying trans middle schoolers today than there are middle schoolers. Recent stat out of the Washington Examiner is that 40% of Brown University students, that was my last, by the way, colonial school visit, 40% of Brown University students claim that to be LGBT, proof that it's, social contagion. But these issues now, we have to be aware of these cultural ones, like you say, Lenny. You can't do cultural apologetics assuming yesterday's apologetic issues like the problem of evil in science and reliability of scripture. That's classical stuff. Those are still valuable, but people are asking new questions. It's like cultural apologetics is like systematic theology. Whereas biblical theology, the categories never change. They're right there in the text. The branch, the rock, the seed. Systematic theology categories change because you're addressing new issues with the culture. Likewise, cultural apologetics. You cannot do apologetics or apologetics evangelism today if you don't understand cultural Marxism today.
Yeah.
And postmodern cultural Marxism in particular.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and Marxism is in this sense, it seems, it's kind of like comparing Marx to Hegel, and when Marx turns Hegel on his head, and, Hegel, nobody can read Hegel, nobody understands it. It's super abstract. He's got this view of history. It's a dialectic, just as Marx immanentizes everything that Hegel, in his, with his quasi-transcendent view of history. But so you're always going to, but where, Marxism is sort of the rubber hitting the road, right? I mean, it's where it's sort of these ideas are lived out, and more visceral, more concrete. I think it was Isaiah Berlin, the philosopher of history, who said, all societies can be described as a culture trying to live out a metaphysical model. And I think that's kind of that's one accurate way to put it. Society, the society's trying to live out a metaphysical model of what it thinks is real, and then you only see the tip of the iceberg of how it actually then works out.
Yeah. So
we have to be hitting it at both levels. You still are doing the work of a more classical apologetics, dealing with the deep metaphysical, epistemological issues, but you also have to have direct engagement, direct action at the level of how it works out, which is in your social ethics.
Right. And this is where, like the famous movie right now, Sound of Freedom, right?
Which we've reviewed, on this channel.
Good. That movie is something that we tagged. Let's see, 10 years ago, we had William Lane Craig do a huge debate at Purdue. 9 years ago, the year after, we thought, boy, how are we gonna match that? We had 4,200 people. If you get the second best debater in, he's already a loser because we just had number one. So what do you do? And we decided, well, let's do something grassrootsy, something that even the pastors will like. Let's do it on human sex trafficking. So we had our big event at Purdue where we brought in an ex-porn star and an ex-sex slave. We had them tell their stories from slavery to freedom, and what better soil for talking about the gospel than in that context. And they were able to share the gospel because they've earned the right to be heard and everyone else knew it. But then as soon as everyone in the room knew that human sex trafficking was evil, then we brought up Michael Ruse, the atheist, with the Christian philosopher from Yale University, and did a debate on God and morality in light of human sex trafficking. So we still went back to the metaphysical grounding, right, for these ethical assumptions that everybody makes. Even today, when we have our certain allies that we need to, FDR and Truman and Churchill had to get together with Stalin because someone worse was in the room at the moment. And so when my friend Peter Boghossian and I make alliances or start naming people, there's a realignment taking place because of what's happening in the culture. But once that enemy of my enemy is gone, we come back to these other things, the things that Peter Boghossian, that Bill Maher, that Joe Rogan, that now that's always on Fox News and even was a host I saw, Douglas Murray. The things that they want about what made the West best and how we need to go back to this. And Steven Pinker and Peter Boghossian are founding faculty members for the new Austin University launching in August in Texas. They think they can have all this stuff with those foundations. And yet it was just 2 months ago, Peter Boghossian finally admitted what I challenged him on when he first asked me for an alliance after he invited me to speak in his atheism seminar at Portland State. I said, okay, we'll create an alliance, but remember, your side was what caused this. And he just admitted this on a podcast, I think 2 months ago, that the new atheism was instrumental in burning to the ground a lot of our foundations in the West.
Yeah, and it should have been kind of obvious, to be honest. It should have been. I mean, to the thoughtful, reflective person, it's like, oh, let's just reject the metaphysical basis, any metaphysical basis for knowledge or truth, and we'll just see what happens. We'll be able to rely on love.
Goodness, treat your neighbor well.
Why? Exactly. And of course, there was obviously a disconnect between the scientific community and any kind of robust philosophical thinking for several decades. You see that when you go back and watch these interviews or debates with somebody like Krauss up there, or they're just philosophically inept, right? I mean, there was this drastic, we just had Stephen Meyer on with regards to his new book, and he lays it out in the historically how the science gets, disconnected from philosophy or, from metaphysics, and the problems that result there in sort of an ignorant scientific community, at least in one sense, right? Where reasoning is just this instrumental sort of thing that we do. Okay, let's come back to, well, you mentioned a lot of non-believers who were allying with in certain ways, even though, again, what is their metaphysical basis for then thinking we can really turn everything back to maybe sort of the moral conventions that they appreciate? And Stephen Meyer did just have he was talking about an interview that he did with Douglas Murray and Tom Holland, the author, not the actor.
Yeah, I saw that
last year, but on Peter Robinson's program. And he was mentioning some at least some developments with Tom Holland.
They call themselves atheistic Christians, right? Christian atheists. That was the phrase.
And Meyer called them the new atheists. That they're amenable to religion, they're amenable to Christianity. They're bemoaning or lamenting the loss of the Christian institutions, and maybe even a Christian perspective on society and morality. But, at some point you got to kind of take the whole package or not. But let's get back to the issue of Marxism then, the neo-Marxism, the March for the Institutions, then we'll kind of wrap up here because I have other engagements today. Okay, critical theory. You were talking about how, look, this is something that you were aware of early. I started writing on it in 2016 when I discovered the works of Herbert Marcuse and read his magisterial work, I guess, Eros and Civilization. I was like, whoa, you know, and then, then all of a sudden you start to see how, as the sort of scientific atheism we were sort of fighting against in the public sphere, but then we had lost track of what was going on in the sociology departments, in the English departments, as Lenny mentioned, in the history departments, and the creeping in of the neo-Marxist social theory. And so how is this? This cannot be engaged in the same way you engage the logical positivism of, the 60s and 70s that then blew up in, with the new atheists, and that's sort of like said waning. How to engage in this more social and personal kind of battle on the campuses?
It's a good question. I mean, there are different kind of foundational issues, different touch point issues with some of these people that adopt the perspectives. You can't, in the past, you couldn't get to the gospel because people would say, well, you want me to believe the message of the man? Yeah, the man is in the book. Yeah, I don't believe the book. Why? Because historical criticism, because of science, blah, blah, blah. Now it's not even that. It's I don't care sometimes about truth. I care about what works. The first indigenous American philosophy, pragmatism. But the old scientism and naturalism of Dawkins, it was so dry and dusty that people needed to cough all the time. This new stuff, even though it's not new, but it's new to us in the culture, it's about ethics. It's about the tip of the iceberg. It's where most people are at. Most people couldn't relate to the dry, dusty chemistry. Even with, Stephen Meyer's intelligent design argumentation, excellent argumentations. Just a lot of people try to wrap their heads around the statistics. They go, wow, I don't know what you just said. It was profound, but whoa, right? But when you're talking about doing justice, when you're talking about George Floyd and racism and burn it all down, right? In the name of justice. Now people have a reason to live. It's said that Darwin gave us a sense of our origin. Marx gave us a telos. He gave us a purpose. And, he's an activist, and people feel good about identifying with a cause, not just dusty, dry doctrine. And that's where I think it's been so appealing, and so appealing inside the church. Again, I remember reading Marcuse in 2004 when I was taking Marxism at Purdue. Again, I was like, "Whoa, this is scary stuff," but I wonder, when is it coming here in mass? And liberation theology much earlier, but still Central South America. But now today, I mean, you're looking at, I was just on the website today for the CCCU, Council for Christian Colleges and Universities.
Yes. Yeah.
On that webpage, they're supposed to unite all the Christian colleges. They've got standard readings in anti-racism that includes, some of the best of Ibram X. Kendi and so forth on that page. And now you're starting to see this. And, when I was going to speak at I wanted to speak at Grove City, going to speak at the only conservative Anglican seminary in the country, and then got disinvited. I was going to follow Tisby at least one, if not both of those talks. And the dean prayed about it, and God told her that only Tisby was to come because I lacked the proper skin pigment to be relevant, right? And furthermore, she let the professors, to much their chagrin, know that she was going to hire a dye officer the next year. I've since been informed that they lost funding, and so that didn't happen. But why even have a dye officer in these institutions? Why does BIOLA University need a dye? Any organization that gets a dye officer spells the death of that institution. And that's what you're finding through these words, these discourses that change the hegemonic narrative of diversity, inclusivity, equity. I mean, shouldn't we all be about that? And of course, here I think we probably know what those words are are intended to mean by the elitists who dominate the narrative.
Yeah.
But most of the people in the Christian church don't know that. They just see George Floyd and that was wrong. And I'm a racist, you're a racist, aren't we all racist? Like the old Dr. Pepper commercial.
Yeah.
And so, you know, everybody and their dog capitulates and puts in a political commissar called the die officer. And that starts to change the university. It changes BIOLA University. You get board members, you know, in these institutions. This is one of our other objectives. You know, you've got someone who's a billionaire there on the BIOLA board that is a member of the World Economic Forum, that has ties with the Clintons, with the Democratic National Convention, who's been investigated by the FBI, who's given money to RTS, who's, you know, BIOLA's money was probably, well, in 2018, 5% came from donors. I think that's the case. Most of it came from tuition dollars and so forth. Fast forward 5 years, 27% of the money is now coming from donors. Who are those donors? And in my industry in support raising, there's the pithy statement, mission drift is but a donor away. And so, you know, the Reality family comes, they graduated from Wheaton, they live in Indonesia. He's one of the donors. There are several woke board members that are there. You control the presidency, the board, the die officer. Eventually you start hiring deans into institutions who then hire faculty. And it's just a cascade. You almost go back to the movie Titanic. If you remember that famous scene where the mathematician who engineered the building of the ship said, we've just, the water's come in, it's gone over 1 lock and 2 and 3. And the rich man says, Titanic can't sink. And he says, it's made of iron, sir. I assure you it can. It's one thing to go over 1, but over 2, 3, and once 4, it cascades and it's inevitable. Yeah. Some of these institutions that are now Christian institutions, that are not Harvard, but that are BIOLA, are right at that level where it's going to be irreversible. And so donors need to wake up, parents need to wake up, philanthropists need to wake up and stop giving to institutions that are subverting the founders and the foundations of those institutions.
Can I ask you a secondary question on all of this? Because we talked about the formation of these ideas, and I've always thought that critical theory is a pseudo worldview, in that it doesn't actually answer all of the questions of a fully fledged worldview. One of the biggest holes I've seen in critical theory was a little bit in the fact that even though Marxism may be a telos, it actually doesn't provide a telos. It provides just an end dream. But it lacks a way of getting,
right? Imagine.
Yeah, it lacks a way of getting there. Yeah, it's imagine. Yeah. It's exactly what it is. It's imagine. So can't we, you know, one of my questions would be to people is like, and what will, okay, then what? How does that, okay, eliminate all of the testing? Say that those people who are black and brown skinned have a story that we can't penetrate and can't understand because we haven't lived their life experience. Where does that bring us? Where does that take? What's the next step? What does utopia look like? Yeah. And how do we get from here to there? How do you, you know, the problem with economics Marxism was Marx never counted on the bourgeoisie. He never counted on the middle class. If it was still feudal lords and serfs, and then there was an overthrow for equality, that kind of thing, yeah, you may have gotten that. But there was this third thing that came in that showed that his whole philosophy kind of broke down. And I think with critical theory, we've got that same thing. It's easy to criticize the person who burned the cake. It's a much harder thing to make a cake from scratch yourself. So how do you make the cake?
Yeah, I think that was Roger Scruton. People would say the philosopher of conservatism, the late philosopher of conservatism, said conservatism, to conserve things is arduous. It's very difficult. To destroy them is easy. Burn it all down.
Well, and Marx, I mean, wasn't that was the Marxism, as everything that came before must die. right? I mean, isn't that
right? That's what critical theory is trading on.
I mean,
Yeah.
so I mean, another book there, I think Alistair McIntyre wrote this while he was still a socialist of some sort. It was before After Virtue. He wrote a book called Marxism and Christianity. It's a short book. I always recommend it.
I've got that. Yeah.
And it's well worth the read because, yeah, I mean, he says it's like, you know, kind of like what the Marxist assumes utopia will be like. Well, as Nancy Pelosi famously said, well, you have to read the bill, or we have to get there before we have to pass the bill before we know what's in it or something.
Yeah.
There is no, it is just, it's an imagined immanentized eschatology, right? I mean, that's another way of putting it. I think that's actually in the Catholic Catechism in the section on Marxism, that Marxism is eschatology immanentized. You know,
my former classmate, one of them that I mentioned, not the one who was prank calling me, that was his roommate, but another one who used to dress in all black, you know, wear a little bit of eyeliner, had the knuckles and so forth.
Yeah.
He was a radical. I knew it from the beginning. He's since written 4 books on anarchy, but he got tenure in Texas, and you know, he cleaned up nicely to go on the job interview. We had a U.S. president that did that as well. And one of the things that really got him in trouble was that he put on his Facebook page, first of all, he had Antifa flag on there, and he would refer to everyone as comrade. He said, "I want the world to burn until the last cop is strangled with the intestines of the last capitalist, who is strangled in turn with the intestines of the last politician." Now, when people saw that, oh my gosh, the university was embarrassed, but what to do? He's tenured, right? And he tried to make light of it and saying, I'm just doing a quote from Diderot in relation to the French Revolution, which both Marx and Lenin absolutely loved. They were orgasmic over the French Revolution. He said, men will never be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest. Well, Marx and Lenin loved that, right? This guy loved that. Now, you may clean up nicely for the job interviews, but a Marxist is a Marxist is a Marxist. And at the end of the day, these people are playing for keeps. They will destroy you. It's not like the old atheism that just ridiculed you. These guys want to burn it all down. And yet then what? Well, then what? It's a utopia. But right now, when we're on the verge of, you know, the dictatorship of the proletariat, workers of the world unite, comrades, you need to have a little dictatorship because, I mean, you got to transition us to full communism, to you know, the utopic dream. What next? We don't know, but why should it matter? We're pursuing justice.
there's a great article, I think it was written in the 60s by a philosopher. I think he was at University of Chicago. Philip Haley, I think, is the name. And I think that the article was entitled, or maybe it was a book, I think it was called From Cruelty to Goodness, where he references one of Himmler's speeches to a group of Nazi soldiers in Poznan, in Poland, about you know, the greatness of the Nazi soul will be shown in that we will be able to finish our work here, which he's talking about the final solution, without any sort of damage being done to our soul or conscience, that we'll be able to do the cruel act of destroying other human beings, because obviously, you know, soldiers who are carrying out this act on the Eastern Front of killing Poles and Jews and everything, they have consciences still. They're going schizophrenic, right? And he wants to say the greatness will be of the Nazi program will be that we will be able to do this cruel act without any damage to our souls. In other words, you'll be able to ruthlessly eliminate another human being, or X number of them, you know, because the project is what really matters at the end of the day. And, you know, this is the heart of evil, right? It's like the individual person can just be sacrificed for the sake of the idea becomes predominant, and the individual is just a number at the end of the day. And you have to live. I mean, we're living with that. We are not learning from history. And this is where critical theory ultimately, I think, is just going to end in another, if taken to its logical extent, it ends in another absolute bloodbath for humanity.
Yeah, I mean, just let's face it, to get an omelet, you have to break an egg. Yeah. Take one for the team, right? And so you have the Jewish person we talked earlier about, whether you need to be a theist or an atheist or a pantheist, or whether any belief at all matters to define your Judaism. But Yuval Harari, who wrote the book *Sapiens*, part of the WEF, he said in this book, according to the science of biology, people were not created, they have evolved, and they certainly did not evolve to be equal. The idea of equality is inextricably intertwined with the idea of creation. The Americans got the idea of equality from Christianity, which argues that every person has a divinely created soul, and that all souls are equal before God. However, if we do not believe in the Christian myths about God, creation, souls, what does it mean that people are equal? Evolution is based on differences. There are no such things as rights in biology. There is no such thing as liberty in biology.
Yeah,
that's right. Now, here's an interesting point,
which is just Nietzsche saying Nietzsche.
Yeah,
basically.
Yeah, it's Nietzsche. Yeah. But here's the difference. So let me draw this out. The first thing that I notice is all of these guys, even your anarchist friend, doesn't want anarchy, say, in regards to the residuals for his books. Those he wants to have continue, right? He wants to make sure that the money comes to him.
Marxists are the best capitalists at times.
They are. Kendi gets what, $25,000 of speaking engagements, or $30,000, something ridiculous like that.
He makes $300,000 a year in speaking engagements. Purdue paid him. They paid him more than Robin DiAngelo, but she's a woman, right?
Right. Okay.
She came in as the second speaker, and then Patrice Cullors, founder of Black Lives Matter, who's a great capitalist.
Yeah, 6,000.
She's the best.
She came in as the third speaker, but Kendi, he was the first one, and he was the highest paid speaker to come.
So here's my point. In all of this, it's always they abstract the idea, they apply it to the other and not to themselves. Christianity has historically taught the reverse.
Yeah.
And let me give you an example. We talked about Constantine. Christianity becomes the de facto understood faith of the Roman Empire. Yeah, Julian tries to switch that, but for 75 years after Constantine, Christianity is growing and thriving. And by the beginning of the 5th century, it is emerging as the primary religious belief system. At the same time, the gladiatorial games are still continuing. People are still slaughtering each other for public sport until a man from the East, Telemachus, jumps into one of the rings and says, these people are made in the image of God, this shall not be. Now, what happens to him? Does everybody say, oh, you're right, we're Christians? No. They say, hey, you're interrupting our sporting events,
our games.
And they killed him. But within a year.
What was his name?
Telemachus.
Saint Telemachus.
So the 404 AD, within a year, the scandal that a bishop of the church, a holy man of God, was slain for his religious convictions spread so far and wide that I think the emperor was Honorius, I think, stopped the gladiatorial games, made them illegal throughout the empire. Christianity has always been self-sacrificial because that's who our savior was. And that's why martyrdom was considered to be a high honor. And that's what actually caused Christianity to grow. So here is a radical difference between Marxism, between critical theory, and between Christianity. Christianity says, yeah, you take one for the team, but you are the one who takes one for the team. And that's what love is. And that's a message that will resonate. It was in the plague of the 160s when there was the Roman Empire was suffering. All of the, and Rodney Stark talks about this in his book, all of the aristocracy of Rome were fleeing to the hillsides, getting away. But the Christians, they were passing on the road because the Christians were coming into the city in order to nurse the sick and the poor. And Stark says that, yeah, of course, Christians caught the plague and died. That's what happens when this kind of thing happens. But the ones who survived and the patients, the Romans that they nursed, even though they were pagans, who survived, came out of it, and two things happened. There were a whole lot more Christians now because those guys converted right away. They looked around and said, hey, look, even my family left me on my deathbed. It was the Christians who came in. And now you have immunities. And Stark believes that that's one of the reasons why in the 3rd century Christianity really started to blow up. It's because of these kinds of approaches that show the heart of the Messiah. And that, again, it's a drastic difference.
Lenny, it is exactly that difference that when Marxism and neo-Marxism seeps into our seminaries and churches, then it's no longer about how can I self-sacrifice for the sake of my community, my country. It's how can I take other people out so that we can rearrange the power structures, often arbitrarily, right? And it becomes about just redistributing power where you're not. It's not about self-sacrifice. It's about attacking others and taking them them down. So it's destruction versus construction. It's attack versus self.
There was a documentary called By What Standard? We've talked about this. So this is the Southern Baptist Convention. It's you can find it on YouTube. Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay poll some of the heads of the Southern Baptist Convention, and they say, Boghossian says, if I were going to design a plan to bring the whole thing down, all of Christendom, how would I do it? I'd make them woke. It'll eat itself from the inside. Yeah. I mean, that's, here are two atheists whose prior life's goal was to defeat Christianity on the campus. I mean, that was what they would do. And they're giving them advice, said, look, you guys have a bigger problem.
Yeah, James Lindsay was instrumental, I think, in turning Al Mohler around when Mohler invited him onto the podcast.
Yes, he had him on the
ironically, recently, so Neil Shenvi's book is coming out. It's going to be excellent. I was invited to provide an endorsement along with about 24 other people, one of them being Peter Boghossian.
Well,
so there is a great realignment happening, and we'll take what we can get because there is something worse in the area that's seeking to subvert the entire basis for the free thinking world, the opportunity to debate. Biggest debate is hate, but you guys know all this.
Well, and I'll put one little point, since this is going to be part of the booklet that I write for you guys on paganism, but this is also, I think, something that we're seeing emerging in our discussion with Owen Anderson a few weeks ago at ASU. And some of the emerging neo-pagan practices and beliefs that are happening on campus. There's a correlation, I think, to be made between critical theory and the rise of what we would call the reemergence of folk religion.
Yeah.
Pre-Christian folk religion. And a lot of this has to do with more the anti-colonialism strain of critical theory, which is a big part of critical theory.
Yeah.
And Christopher Rufo, you mentioned earlier, has written about this. And sort of a return, this is not just sort of 19th century Wicca. This is like an actual return to pre-Christian, pre-colonial folk religious practices, where you are invoking the names of Native American gods or Aztec gods in the schools. You're praying to the goddesses, right? And I think we have one thing to point out is how critical theory, nobody's going to stay atheist unless you might get the average, the anomaly who stays the rigid materialist. But culture by and large is going to go in a spiritual and religious direction. It's just a question of which way. And I think we got a emerging neo-paganism on our hands, that critical theory now, if sort of the scientific materialism laid the seedbed for critical theory in neo-Marxism to explode and take root. Neo-Marxism is providing the seabed for a return to pagan religion.
Yeah, and that's Boghossian's admission in his podcast about 2 months ago, was that, yeah, within neo-atheism, we knew that we would be eroding the field while destroying God. We didn't know what gods were going to emerge in its place, and it turns out they're worse.
Right. And that goes back to good old Chesterton's old phrase, when man stops worshiping, God doesn't stop he doesn't stop believing, he'll believe in anything. And some of those anythings are going to be actual spiritual beings. All right, Corey, let's wrap it up then. You kind of started going in this direction. Give us you're going to go hypothetically, you're going to go talk to a church. You're going to talk to a group of 30 and under. Okay. Give them what do you see that is a positive turn? Where is the hope right now that you see some movement that you would want to convey to a younger audience first, and then I want to ask the same question of what you convey to an older audience.
I mean, because
so that we don't sound like Rod Dreher and all move to Hungary.
Yeah, because of postmodernism, it has cleaned all truth claims off the table, opening things up for potential others. But those others are everybody except for the dominant oppressor class. So that doesn't do us a whole lot of good at this point. But there is a certain openness with postmodernism that has, created a vacuum, so to speak. There are places where we can step in with that regard. There are still people who love Jesus, and maybe they're progressive Christians, maybe they're liberal, maybe they're nominal Christians, who knows? And you start there, and you start with the commitment to Christ, living the life, the seedbed of the martyrs, or the blood of the martyrs was the seedbed of the church, as we just discussed. But you live the apologetic lifestyle. And then you begin challenging these Christians, the Christian pastors, that skinny jeans and fog machines doesn't have much shelf life, and adopting false philosophies without being able to understand what they are is bad shepherding. Jesus commanded us, not invited us, love God with all your mind. So we start from Christ and then move forward. And then we talk about the role of apologetics and how the hope in 1 Peter, the entire backdrop, first of all, it's a command. And according to our modern sociology, it's back in demand. But it's always been a command in Scripture. But the context of the command is Job's own context. It's Habakkuk's own context. It's Romans starts out, the obedience of faith, chapter 1, chapter 16, and the heart of Romans is 5 through 8, and that core has suffering in 5 and 8. 1 Peter 3 is about suffering and talking about the context in which I would be prepared to give the head, heart, and hands response to anyone who asks. Well, what if they don't ask? Well, you're right. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't force them to drink. But you can give them salt lick. You can put pebbles in their shoes. You can make them thirsty. And you can make them thirsty in part by having what you have, right? Like so many of those early pagans that converted. So we have to, we can't short shift the foundational stuff, the fundamental stuff, and that is the lifestyle apologetic. Love God with our mind. The integrated man ought to be loving God with head, heart, and hands. But pastors, do you realize that part of the shepherd's job is to be able to guard from every wind of false belief? And that entails that you have to know what those beliefs are. And so we have this whole field of Christian thought, apologetics, philosophy, and things like that should be part of your obligation. So, there's a lot of things that could be said, but I think, in the spirit of Epictetus, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, so that we listen more. Who is the person that I'm addressing? Is it a pastor who's woke? Is it a pastor who just doesn't love God with his mind? Is it a student who's got a lot of potential and people in the congregation, you need to do the end run around the pastor? So be it. You need to do an end run around academic deans and department heads to get into various people in the seminaries, or do the end run around the administrators at universities. I think it depends on our audience, our context, but we've got to start from the beginning, and that is Jesus, and living the apologetic lifestyle that's attractive, be willing to suffer, as what was the guy Richard Wurmbrand used to say back in the Russian prisons? He used to say, bless you, prison, bless you, prison. It really reminds me of when I was, in boot camp. You get dropped to do push-ups, and you stop and you say, drill sergeant, thank you for conditioning my mind and my body. Drill sergeant, please feel free to do so at any time. Drill sergeant, Private Miller requests permission to recover, right?
Embrace
There's
the
a sense, and there's a sense in which suffering is what we signed up for. Philippians 1:29. It's part of Job. It's part of Habakkuk. Suffering in the providence of God. We're going to have to go through suffering, and we ought to like the result that it's going to form our souls, and we ought to not see this world as our home. But we have a job to do, and we need to be strategic about it. We need to be faithful about it, and we need to raise up our families, but we also need to reclaim the institutions.
Amen.
Yeah, that was great.
Let's leave it at that. Corey Miller, it's always a pleasure to see you. God bless you, and hopefully our paths will cross in person soon, somewhere in the country. And but we look forward to maybe doing another couple episodes with you. It's always good to see you. All right.